Okay, this is Domestic, Day 2. Teen culture during the 1950s is very different than it is today. These were some of the rules for teen culture in the 1950s. Obey authority, control your emotions, don't make waves, fit in with the group, and don't ever, ever, ever think about sex. Of course, this is what parents would like to have thought about their teenagers in the 1950s, but it wasn't necessarily always the truth. There were juvenile delinquents. Okay, in 1951, J.D. Salinger writes a book called A Catcher in the Rye. It's about a private school kid, very rich kid, who is out of the norm, basically. And this kind of brought up the whole idea of the outliers, the not perfect teenager, that maybe everything wasn't exactly the way it's depicted in the TVs and in the movies. Okay, so this is Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando in a movie called The Wild One, and he was a motorcycle guy who just went against the norm, wore his sideburns, smoked cigarettes, was not your average teenager. And then we have some more rebellion with a star named James Dean. And James Dean, superstar during the 1950s in a movie called Rebel Without a Cause. And these are your precursors to the hippies, and they were known as beatniks. And the beat generation, these are the kids and people that were kind of smoking that funny stuff and doing poetry in the coffee houses. Jack Kerouac writes a famous book called On the Road about actually stealing a car or going on the road and going against society. Allen Ginsberg writes a poem called Howl, which is talking about sex and homosexuality and things that were just kind of taboos in the 1950s. Other writers that kind of went outside that norm of the 1950s respectability, Neal Cassady and William S. Burroughs. So your typical beatnik looked like this guy here on the left, wore his hair a little bit longer, had the bongo drums, and walked to a different beat. This was from a show called Dobie Gillis, and you've got the clean-cut Dobie Gillis here on the right. See, I'm home. 1950s, the word teenager entered the American language. Prior to that, it really hadn't been a thing. And teens had money, so you're going to have records. They were 45s, singles, and you're going to have this new kind of music that people called race music, and we call rock and roll. Elvis Presley comes to the forefront in the 1950s, and he, of course, was the king. He got his start right here in Shreveport, Louisiana. Still looks good, doesn't he? So I'm going to do a little clip on Elvis and his first. This is him at the Louisiana Hayride. We've got a statue of Elvis downtown there, right outside the Coliseum there, and he is wowing the crowds, and people are screaming and loving them some Elvis Presley. He's going to have his first TV appearance, and he will sing Hound Dog, and then first primetime appearance is on a show called Ed Sullivan, and people again are screaming, and they make a ruling that he has to be filmed from the waist up because he's just entirely too sexy from the waist down. This was your standard radio during the 1950s. And then in the later 50s, they're going to come up with transistor radios and rock and roll stations, which parents were just sure that their children were doomed and were
listening to this sinful music.
Lots of teenage idols during the 1950s. Most of them sang and were in movies as well. And Frankie Avalon was one of the teen idols and famously coupled with a former Mouseketeer named Annette Funicello. They made several kind of beach movies. Fabian was another teen idol, and he had his hair just a little bit longer, so he was a little bit more of a bad boy, but also a singer and an actor in these movies. The television set was a piece of furniture in the house, and of course there were no flat screen TVs, and this is kind of what the average television looked like. You aren't going to get color TV until the 1960s. The number one genre of TV in the 1950s was the Western. Walt Disney put out a weekly show about Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, with his raccoon cap. The Lone Ranger had a program weekly with Lone Ranger and his faithful sidekick Tonto, and it would start out, who was that masked man? And then the longest running Western was a show called Gunsmoke with Matt Dillon and his longtime girlfriend, Miss Kitty, who ran the local saloon. He had several deputies over the time period, but this was the longest running Western of all time. The sitcom came into being during the 1950s, and the sitcom was typically a mom and a dad and a couple of kids. The ideal family. The dad would go off to work, the mom would keep the house and cook wonderful meals for the children. The children would get into mischief, which the dad ultimately would step in and solve the problem that the kids got into. So this was the Nelson family, and you've got Ricky and David, and the mom and dad, Ozzie and Harriet. Ricky grew up to be another teen idol, and he was a singer. He's going to transition into country music, and sadly is going to be killed in an airplane accident. One of the iconic shows, again, was the Cleavers, and you've got the mom and the dad, Mr. and Mrs. Cleaver here, and then you've got the older brother Wally, and then Beaver, the Beaver, and the Beaver is a young kid. He quite often got into different messes that sometimes Wally helped him out with, and sometimes the dad would step in.
Lucy, I'm home.
The number one show of all time was I Love Lucy. And I Love Lucy, just Desi and Lucy. And the Honeymooners. Both of these families lived in New York City. Desi was a nightclub performer. He had his own band. Lucy would be at home and get into all sorts of mischief. And then the Honeymooners, Ralph Cramden was a bus driver. And so you had kind of an upper level living with the Lucy show and more of a lower middle class with the Honeymooners. Underneath, well, on the apartment below them, their neighbors Trixie and Ralph. Well, not Ralph. Can't remember his name. He worked in the sewer system. He was with the sanitation department. I Love Lucy's classic commercial, which I'm going to put a link to here in Canvas, was the commercial that she did. It's a vitamin that is got an alcohol content, and this is her classic routine that I will post for y'all.
This is what people would see when they would turn their TVs on if the station was not on. And back in the day, there were either 2 or 3 stations, and they would be off the air at midnight each night, and then come on the air between 5 and 6 in the morning, usually with a farm report, some sort of news report. And in between, they would put this test pattern up, and it would just make a sound like, and people wanted that because they wanted to make sure their TV was working. So this was a test pattern that they would see when they turned their TV on and waiting for a program to come on. Because of the space program that is going to be started and movies, we are going to have shows and movies about invasions from outer space. And people actually thought they were seeing UFOs during this time period. So this is just an example of some of them: Forbidden Planet, Invaders from Mars, and War of the World. And these were usually really cheap movies with really kind of icky, crazy effects, special effects. You can sometimes see the wires, and people loved them. So Hollywood used these aliens as a metaphor for what? If you said communism, you would have been correct. During this time period, we were terrified of a nuclear attack. And here you see children doing the duck and cover when the alarm went off. In case of a nuclear attack, they got underneath their desks for protection. People also built fallout shelters and stocked them with, you can see, canned water, canned foods, blankets, and so forth. You've got Godzilla, which is created by underground testing. In 1957, the Soviets launched the very first satellite, and that very first satellite is Sputnik. And this is going to change everything in the United States. We are behind the Soviets. They are the first to do this. And we aren't sure at this point what exactly Sputnik can do. And we don't know if it's got lasers in it. We don't know if it's taking pictures. We aren't sure what's going on with it. And we are going to change our educational system to concentrate more on science and math so we can do something to catch up with the Soviets. We developed NASA, and our first man that we put into space is Alan Shepard, and he basically goes up and he comes right back down again. But he's the first with the Gemini program, the NASA Gemini program, and he is one of our original astronauts. This happens in May of 1961. And we're going to have a brand new president in 1961, John F. Kennedy, and he is going to pour lots of money, and he is going to make a promise that we will reach the moon by the end of the decade. People scoffed at him, but we're going to do it. The very first human being in space was a Russian, and his name was Yuri Gagarin. And this is a picture of Yuri. The first American to orbit the Earth, and he did it 3 times. He was supposed to do it more, but they had some technical problems, was John Glenn. John Glenn is a true American hero. Not only was he an astronaut, but then he's going to serve his country as a senator from Ohio, and then he's going to become the oldest man to go into space. He is going to go up with the space shuttle when he's in his 70s. You can see President Kennedy here looking at the spaceship, and this is the, it looks pretty small there, but this is the capsule that Glenn went 3 orbits around the Earth in. And of course, this is the very famous picture of the first man to walk on the moon, and that is Neil Armstrong. Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. So you can see the footprints there. We're going to leave a flag. There's 3 flags up there right now. And they're going to gather dirt and samples and moon rocks. And this is a very, very, very big deal.